So good afternoon, everybody, or good morning for you. In Israel, we already afternoon. My name is Oren Yiftachel from Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, and also from the Land for All movement and other places as well. But I'm very happy to share with you our thoughts about the future path for peace that our movement has been advancing for the last 8 years. And I'll start with a bit of description why it's needed a new approach, the Confederation approach. What are the dangers? Why is the deadlock? And what are the different paths that we offer to break the deadlock? I will speak for about half an hour, then we'll still have about 20 minutes for questions and answers. Hopefully the technology will not fail us. And thank you very much for the technical staff that enabled me to actually show the presentation, which is important. I'm a geographer and an urban planner, so the visuals are a very big part of the presentation, although of course the message stands regardless. So I'm starting with these two fridge magnets that we bought. Me and my wife just walked through the old city of Jerusalem a few months ago, and we in Bab el Amud, in Nablus Gate, Damascus Gate in English, and we saw these two magnets that are almost identical. One of them says Israel, and the other one says Palestine. And we bought both. And probably many of you that visit Israel-Palestine, you see that kind of very, very similar imagery of the land, of the homeland. And I got a quote here from A.B. Yoshua, the most senior, most famous Israeli author and very much activist and philosopher of our situation, that he said a couple of years ago, the deep reason why the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is so protracted is the overlapping visions of the homeland by both peoples. This will not go away. So this is the point of departure. The homeland is very much similar in the imagination, in the goals, in the future orientation of both peoples, the Zionist Jews and the Palestinian Arabs. This is quite rare among conflicts around the world. Usually there is a conflict around a particular region, around a border, but this here, the homeland, is overlapping. And of course, we are reminded on it time and again in real life situation. For example, what we call Bloody May in 2021, where there was a lot of violence in Israel-Palestine. In Arabic, they call it Habbat Iyar, the sort of demonstrations or uprising of Iyar, of May. And you could see I mapped here, based on a New York Times article, the different places where the events flared up. Jerusalem, Sheikh Jarrah, of course, and demonstration also in Khalil and in Nablus and in Jenin, and then inside and in Gaza, of course, with all the missiles and the Hamas attacks, etc., and Israel, very, very strong attack, but also the mixed cities in Israel, in many places where there hasn't been riots in the past and violent clashes. Jaffa, Lid, Ramla, worst of all perhaps is Akko, that wasn't covered here, just to show you that the whole land responded, of course, not in an identical fashion, but nonetheless it illustrated the idea that it is one land for the Palestinians and for the Jews, of course, because the Jews too were involved in all these conflicts. And then we have this report a few weeks after the Bloody May that 91 of the arrests were Arabs inside Israel, where the violence that flared, I don't have an accurate exact measurement, but it was very symmetric. Jews attacked Arabs, Arabs attacked Jews. There was a lot of, I think the death and injury toll is quite different, and yet 91% of the indictments were against Arabs. This is just an illustration to the lopsided nature of things, and this is a danger. This lopsided illuminates the danger of apartheid. And the danger of apartheid is when there is no solution and there is one group that is so dominant politically, militarily, economically, and legally. We're starting to see the danger of Israel-Palestine becoming an apartheid regime. And we have some quotes here. Ehud Olmert, who was the previous prime minister before Netanyahu, we said in 2008, failure to create a viable Palestinian state could plunge Israel into a South African-style apartheid struggle. Mustafa Barghouti, a Palestinian leader of the Third Way, said something similar in 2018. The very public visit of Nelson Mandela in Israel-Palestine, the title was that Israel is the worst kind of apartheid regime, just 3 years ago. John Kerry, the US Secretary of State, announced a unitary state for Israelis and Palestinians winds up either being an apartheid state with second-class citizens, or it destroys the capacity of Israel to be a Jewish state. So here you have just highlighting what is quite obvious and leading us to the title of the lecture, which is Peace or Apartheid. And this is what we offer, we suggest is a way out of the deadlock that is leading us to an apartheid situation. So you might ask, Oren who? So I said, I'm a researcher and lecturer in Ben-Gurion University, also a social activist, political activist. And these are some of my recent books: Ethnocracy, about the regime in Israel-Palestine in comparison to other ethnic conflicts around the world, and recent work also about the Bedouins and the legal geography of the Negev, and also books in Arabic and Hebrew, which I think is very important. More images of the whole land as one unit. This is the PLO. Abbas symbol is the whole land. Even Hamas, which is religious with emphasis, still the map here is the whole land is Palestine. Of course, Israel in all the official maps, all the publications, everywhere on the news, on the weather reports, all the advertisement, you see that Israel is claiming, here it's written Israel and the whole land between Jordan and sea. But the reality check is, of course, very different. The process between the Jordan and the sea has been the Judaization of this area over the last 100 years, a very profound process where land has been massively appropriated by the Israeli state. And at the moment, 96% of the land inside the Green Line and 88% of the land between Jordan and sea is actually state or Jewish land, where, of course, before 1948, it was the opposite. The Jews have established 1,178 settlements. You see all these red dots. And the Palestinian Arabs actually have shrunk the population from 48 Nakba until now is very much into enclaves, and it has from 1,015 settlements and towns, it's now just halved. So the situation, the political geography is very much in that direction, although even the Israeli Jewish expansion has slowed down in recent years, and it's more like a stalemate with some Jewish expansion. The population, by the way, as you see here, is more or less half at the moment. Half of the population between the Jordan and the sea is Jewish, and about half is Palestinian. So there is very much asymmetric situation where Jews control massive amount of the resources, and also having just come recently and invaded and colonized the land. This is, of course, very, very much the background to the conflict. So what we can see here, as you know, 700,000 Jews live beyond the Green Line. They're settlers. About 250,000 in Jerusalem, what Israel annexed from Jerusalem, and then the rest, 450,000 in elsewhere in the West Bank. Israel is still holding the Palestinian under military occupation. You know that Gaza is under siege, and also there are about almost 2 million Palestinian Arabs inside Israel. About 50% family income is about 50% among the Palestinians in Israel, and even lower in the West Bank, and the Bedouins in the Negev are very much suffering demolition and deprivation. The momentum is very obvious, moving towards creeping apartheid. And part of the Palestinian problem is that Hamas, which is holding Gaza and continuing to use terrorism against Israeli citizens, which is, of course, not just a war crime, but it actually exacerbates the deadlock. And that was the Trump plan. That was probably the last hooray of the two-state solution. This was a cruel caricature of the two-state solution, where, if you know, in 2020, the Israeli government actually accepted, or the prime minister accepted it, but it was a plan that was a non-starter because it took about a third of the West Bank and gave it to Israel. It annexed all the settlements to Israel against international law, etc. So many of you know the situation. It's quite bleak. What are the solutions that are now on the table to offer it in the public discourse? The two main solutions: two-state solution or one-state solution. We argue in the movement where Palestinian and Israeli got together, as I said, about 8 years ago, that neither of these solutions actually offering us a way out of the deadlock. The two-state solution, we can say 73 years we've attempted to implement it, total failure, time and time again. And if there are all these failures, of course, you can say this side is blamed for this event and other for this event. Of course, the two sides are part of it. Israel is stronger, but the Palestinians very much a part of this equation. So there is the legacy of the Nakba inside the Green Line that is part of the conflict and has to be part of the solution. Nobody's dealing with that, with a two-state solution. There is the imagery that there could be a clean Palestinian state and Jewish states inside the Green Line without much mixing, which of course is an illusion. As we said, there's 700,000 Israelis on the east side of the Green Line, and there's almost 2 million Palestinian Arabs on the other side of the Green Line. Further than that, Jerusalem is undividable as a livable city. And also the question of the refugees. There's millions of Palestinian refugees awaiting a solution to give them what every person around the world deserves, is citizenship and permanent status. So the two-state solution has failed. It sort of ignored some of the very, very basic core issues of what is the conflict, and it ignored the geography. The one-state solution, on the other hand, we feel is apolitical. First of all, there are two national movements, and the goal is to control a state. Two very strong national movements that will not go away. One state solution actually eliminates the existence of Israel. So it is against international law for a state to disappear unless it's by agreement, which is very, very rare. So vast majority of the Israeli Jews oppose it. It will also probably be a state with an Arab majority, which will also risk some of the elements of Jewish self-determination. And there's no one political leader, respectable political leader, that actually promotes this. This is why it's an idea that's mainly intellectual. Most Palestinian intellectuals today believe in the one-state solution. I can see the reasons for it, because the two-state solution has created this kind of apartheid at the moment. But on the other hand, it's very, very difficult to imagine this kind of agenda coming to fruition. Also because Israel has a right to exist as a state. So what is the conclusion? That the land cannot be partitioned, but nor can it be unified. We are in that deadlock. All partition attempts have failed time and time again. Numerous initiatives since Madrid, Oslo, further until John Kerry and recently Trump, all of them total failures. And yet, as we said, to unite it to one state is impossibility. It's not even on a political or legal agenda that anybody can hook into to further it as a political mobilization that we very, very much need. We need the mobilization of Jews and Palestinians toward a solution that will take us out of the apartheid. In that comes our movement. Groups of Israelis, Palestinians, Arnel Mashni, a Palestinian previous PLO senior, and Meron Rappaport, an Israeli journalist, very highly respected, the two people that actually started to gather around them. And we had a few meetings, very important foundation process of about 30 people over about 10 meetings, mostly in Bet Jala. And we came up with some kind of a constitution in 2013, started to work. And since then, we are working on the idea of a confederation. And a confederation, just from a political science perspective, are two or more sovereign entities, yet the borders between them are open and they share institution and share certain aspect of management, but yet they have the possibility, of course, of also retreating from it. So it's a voluntary agreement of political sovereign entities to manage better the space between them in a more just and more economically and socially beneficial and environmentally beneficial way. And this is, we were called in the beginning, two states, one homeland, which alludes to the idea that the homeland is the same for the Palestinians and for the Jews. Two states will be in it, although they will be open, they will share capital. And this for us seems to be squaring the circle of the impossibility to partition the land and the impossibility of uniting it. And we have an internet site, everybody is invited. We have a very active Facebook. There is material in Hebrew, Arabic, a little bit less in English, but we have quite a few publications in English. And I'll show you also some of the media events and international events that we held that were very successful. Yet I would stress our agenda, which for us seems to be the just one and the most practical one, still hasn't broken through. And as people in Britain, people that have experienced a lot of sharing, opening borders, put Brexit aside for the moment, have shown the great benefits of this kind of solutions. In Europe, which was the graveyard of the humanity in the 20th century, has become a kind of confederation, and also a bit less rosy, but nonetheless the situation that Israel-Palestine would probably prefer to the current situation is Bosnia, where there was terrible civil war, and currently there's a confederation working between the various parts, and many other historical examples. It's not an easy model to think about, but for us it's the only way forward. So we had quite a lot of conferences, movement, organizations, debates on the internet, publication. I'll just show you some of the images. We haven't broken through as a major actor yet, but there are a lot of people, and we say to you, people that are listening now to Limud, that the idea has to spread for the benefit of Jews, for the benefit of Palestinians. And here you see both Arnel Mashni and Meron Rappaport that actually have been elected the leaders and coordinators and general managers of the Palestinian branch and of the Israeli branch, because the movement also operates like a confederation. The Palestinians have their own sovereignty, the Israelis have, and we have a constitution we agreed on. Recently, we published a notebook that really gives a narrative about it. You can find it on the site. and many such events. One of the highlights was appearing in the European Parliament about 3 years ago, I think, in Brussels, and we got a good hearing. Of course, the Europeans very much support, but what do they do about it? Which is currently very much needs to be pushed forward to go beyond the traditional two-state solution, to think about confederation, put it on the table. And the Europeans, while they support it, they always wait for the Americans. I would say it's time to stop waiting, push the initiative, a European initiative for confederation in Israel-Palestine. This is part of, you see, it was a packed European Parliament session, quite really good presentations. This year, another highlight that our movement received the Luxembourg Peace Prize. Sad irony is that Nasri Barghouti, who is one of the leaders of the Palestinian side, couldn't even go because he didn't get the permit, of course, to exit the West Bank, which is actually illuminating the need to go forward. So what are our principles for the last 6 or 7 minutes? The key principles: 2 sovereign entities, Israel and Palestine, exactly on the 67 borders. We don't think border changes are necessary because we change the way the borders are managed. Once you start changing the geography of the borders, it's endless. And of course, as we saw with the Trump plan, it's actually an invitation for the stronger side enforcing border changes that are one-sided. The 67 borders are accepted by the international community, by international law, as the legitimate borders of Israel, and they should stay exactly that. We're talking about gradual free movement, Schengen style, or the way that the European process gradually opened up the borders. It's a winning strategy. It's, of course, had quite a few crises, but nonetheless, it's absolutely something that we think have held Europe as a region of peace. And this is what we plan for Israel-Palestine. There is no forced uprooting. That is, we think that Jews could live under Palestinian sovereignty. And this, of course, alludes to the issue of the settlements, which is a very, very hotly debated issue. We don't think the settlement should stay as Jewish settlement, Jewish colonial settlement. No, they will be under Palestinian sovereignty, but under the spirit of reconciliation. The Palestinians might say to many of the settlements, you can stay under our rules, as is in international law. People that are beyond the borders are always subject to the sovereignty of the state they're in. So they will stop being colonial. They'll stop being the element that actually prevents the Palestinian state as it is now. The Jewish settlements now are illegal and preventing a Palestinian state. The Jews that will choose to stay will be under Palestinian management. It looks imaginary at the moment, or illusionary, but things like this happen in the past in many instances of post-conflict. This is another no forced uprooting, and of course no forced uprooting of Palestinians, as quite often suggested by Israeli Jews. Right of return to Palestine. So the right of return, which is a sacred right, the haq al-auda for the Palestinians, which is very much always shoved to the side, is one of the centers of the conflict. We suggest every Palestinian has the right of return, as it is in international law, but to Palestine, not to Israel. So the Palestinian state will be Gaza and the West Bank, and the Palestinians that will wish to return will return there and get Palestinian citizenship. But then they have freedom of movement. So there is a partial right of return also to Israel, but not as citizens. That is, they don't upset the Israeli political system, the Israeli political community. People that might go to work or to shop or to the beach, they can actually move around freely at the end of the period that this arrangement will be put in place, but will not risk the Israeli sovereignty and Israeli politics. Jerusalem, we think it's, of course, very, very pivotal. Not only it's sacred, not only it has a great, enormous value for Jews, Palestinians, Christians, Muslims around the world. It's also a dense, tight geography that can explode, as we see in the last few weeks, at any time. You know, the mosque, the Western Wall, the churches of the Holy Sepulchre, and all what we call the Sacred Basin. So we think Jerusalem should have a Brussels solution, and that goes along with the spirit of confederation. Jerusalem should be a region which is shared by Palestinians and Israelis. It should be the capital of Palestine, the capital of Israel, in arrangement that exists around the world. For example, in Belfast, as you know, there is a revolving mayorship of Protestant and Catholic. There's in Chandigarh in India too, there's a capital of 2 states, Haryana and Punjab. We have examples around the world with power sharing. But yet, of course, Israelis and Palestinians can live there, and they will have a region, a capital region, we call it, that will be, of course, diffuse the conflict, because when it belongs to the Israelis, including access to the holy places and to the Palestinians, it will diffuse the conflict. We also suggest that there will be a council, a religious councils of Jews, Christians, and Muslims that will actually manage the holy places. For example, the Waqf is now managing the Haram al-Sharif, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and that should be management among the religious institutions for all the holy places to take it out of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There should be a joint institution that will be built gradually, starting with very technical and more economic institutions that will deal with the environment, of course, the climate crisis, with land management, which also we have deterioration of land in Israel-Palestine because of over-farming, issues of trade, issues of labor migration, issues of currencies, and it will build itself up, maybe thicken up to more and more meaningful shared institution, although it might also stay as more technical, economic, and environmental. But later on, as part of the reconciliation, there could also be committees of truth and reconciliation. There could be a High Court of Justice as the states decide to move forward. Palestinians in Israel, of course, are quite often forgotten in the conflict and in its resolution. They're very much part of the conflict and therefore part of the resolution. We saw in the Bloody May the cities burning in Israel because of the Palestinian minority. So we think it's very much in balancing and stabilizing the Israeli state as a stable democracy. It should be room for national minority rights for the Palestinians, representation, autonomy. As we all know about minorities around the world, achieve good modus vivendi with the states. Say Canada is a good example. Holland is a good example. A lot of multicultural states that reach good agreements with minorities inside them. I know that Britain, with Scotland, for example, there is always tension about that. But, some of the things that we have to deal with to stabilize the situation is the Palestinian national minority inside Israel, citizens of Israel. And the last point is that must be an international envelope of international law. What's good about this plan, that it is within the limits of international law. It doesn't break any convention, like the one-state solution, for example, breaks a convention, or all the solutions that were offered for ghettoize or cut through the Palestinian territory, like in the Camp David or in the Kerry plan or in the Trump plan. All of them were really breaking international law that determines the green line is the border. We said stay with international law, but there need to be an international envelope of the UN, the European Union, the US, the Arab League, much like Northern Ireland that was enveloped by Britain, by the EU, by United States, that allowed the Protestants and Catholics to actually move forward, renounce violence, give away their weapons. This seems like a faraway dream, but of course, when there is an international envelope that also gives incentives, also limits the use of violence and terror, we can have actual real progress. And with terms of restitution, of course, our concept for that is that people will be restituted for all damage from the conflict, but correcting all injustice will not create new injustice. So Jews, for example, that in good faith purchased houses in Jerusalem that belonged previously to the Palestinians cannot be displaced. So there must be frameworks to restitute for damages that will not injure the rights of the people now. So I'm almost finishing. There's a few nice diagrams and maps about how it will happen. The media coverage that we had was quite extensive, but perhaps not enough. We invite you all to write about us. But we had, for example, foreign policy, special issue about us. We had BBC coverage, we had a lot of radio and television, but still, as I said, we haven't broken into sequence of solutions that everybody's talking about. And that's where it should be. For the benefit of Palestinians and Israelis, it must be confederation as we see the only way forward. So let's finalize this with the song that represented Israel in the Eurovision a few years ago with Mira Awad, who is a Palestinian, and Achinoam Nini, who is an Israeli Jew. And they say, when I cry for both of us. My pain has no name. And when I cry to the merciless sky and say, there must be another way. And I want to suggest that this is a confederation between Israel and Palestine. Thank you very much. And let's open it for discussion. Question about defense. We actually employed experts from the research center in Ramat Aviv about defense issues. And actually only last week, Pnina Sharvit, that was one of the main attorneys of the army, published a report from that center that they say that they're actually quite relaxed about it. As long as there will be a strong management and policing of the external border of Israel-Palestine, they are not particularly worried for security in terms of Israeli-Palestinian Confederation. They themselves had some other reservation, but this is a second report that says that in terms of the threats that exist on Israel, a confederation actually could even be beneficial for protecting Israelis and Palestinians from external threats. Of course, it goes without saying that when there's a confederation, reconciliation and peace, militia groups like Hamas or like many of the settlers that are armed to the teeth, they'll have to de-arm and the states will have to control, as all organized states do. They'll control the violence, and of course they have to renounce all kind of terrorism, etc. I know that people are skeptical about it, and they have a good reason, because in the past there was a lot of terrorism after this kind of agreements, but none of them, let me stress, none of them was a peace agreement. No agreement between Israel and Palestinians was a peace agreement. A peace agreement like we saw in Northern Ireland, agreement with the Basque, agreement in East Timor, agreement with Kosovo that ensures the rights of the minorities, security issues just disappear. Experience enough to know that they're not going to disappear overnight, but the root of the problem is the excessive use of violence that is premised on the lack of solution and ongoing conflict. And of course, the use of violence, let's stress it, is mutual. Palestinians and the Israelis are using a lot of violence. And as I said, the Institute of Security Studies have shown that Confederation is actually quite a good model to ensure long-term stability and security. How would Hamas be persuaded to let go of the stated objective in the charter eliminate the state of Israel from the river to the sea? Of course, this is one of the questions. Is the Palestinian, as you know, the PLO, the overall umbrella, has accepted peace, has accepted the state of Israel, as you know, 1993. Hamas very much is part of the Palestinian national movement. They will have to, of course, accept Israel. This is part of the negotiation. We're not particularly worried about that, because Hamas even recently have changed their, as you know, their policy very, very publicly. They said that we will establish a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, meaning that they accept de facto the existence of Israel. This is not de jure, and of course the charter will have to be changed. But if there is reconciliation, and especially a confederation, not that it's an easy nut to crack, but nonetheless, Hamas, we expect, will go with the majority of Palestinians. I'm sure there will be a referendum here and a referendum there, like we do these things. And a lot of movements like the IRA or the ETA or the Kosovo terrorist movement that exists accept the will of the people. And this is the situation. Mind you, of course, also Israel has to accept the security of the Palestinians and the rights of the Palestinians as part of the solution. There's a question about Iran. I skipped that. I think the whole issue with Iran is irrelevant. There's a lot of noise about Iran. People here on the ground, if Palestinians and Israelis accept peace, Iran will lose all its rhetoric about salvaging Jerusalem for the Muslim, because the Palestinians themselves will have, Palestinians and the Muslim establishment will have part of managing Jerusalem. Dunetz is asking, does the Golan remain Israeli-Palestinian, or does it go, well, these shifts, it moves the question, but the Golan is not part of this deal. The Golan is an issue between Israel and Syria. The Golan is an illegally occupied territory by Israel. On the other hand, Syria at the moment is a criminal state. So I think this will have to await the right opportunity for Israel and Syria to reach peace. There is another question. Wouldn't the wealthy settlement with ample water and other resources be a huge provocation to local Palestinians? Would the settler be willing to give apart those privileges? Well, very good question. I think one of the obstacles for peace are the settlements. And this is why we keep it quite vague. Our constitution says that Jews will be allowed to live in Palestine. And this is the principle of the Confederation. It will be up to the Palestinians, and I've stressed many times, they will decide what will be the planning laws, the resource distribution, the environmental arrangement in the settlements that choose to stay. They might have a period of 3 years or 5 years. My gut feeling is that many of the Jews will prefer to leave and return to the west side of the Green Line. That's my hunch from a lot of knowledge and a lot of discussion with the settlers. But nonetheless, it will be good in a way of peace that the Palestinians will have even a small Jewish minority inside Palestine to create a balance. And of course, it's good also for the Israeli Jews that they have a right to live in Palestine as the Palestinians have the right to live in Israel, by the way, as an Israeli citizen, so they don't threaten the Palestinian political system. It also, we have a lot of details that much that the land and the possession that were illegally taken and exported from the Palestinians have to be settled have to be resolved, have to be returned to the Palestinian landowners. The all kind of arrangement that the Palestinian side have developed a document with 9 points about how land and resources that belong to Palestine will be returned to Palestine. So it is a very good question. It is a very thorny point. The settlement itself will not agree, most of them. It will have to be against, like the extremes of the Palestinians. It will have to be the majority forcing the rule, maybe through a referendum, through an agreement that will have, because the Israeli Jewish settlers will not accept this kind of arrangement. But if the majority of Israelis, which we see all the time, support peace, it will be a way to make them agree to the condition that actually will also protect their basic rights, the right to citizenship, the right to housing, etc., and Israel and the world will have to deal with that. Also, it's done in the past. It is very difficult. I don't gloss over it. The settlements and the refugees, the Palestinian refugees and the Jerusalem are the hardest nut to crack. This is why none of the peace offers has ever touched those in a satisfactory way. And this is why we do that. We go to this hard question and we offer practical and just solutions. There's no perfect justice, but there is movement towards justice. And this is very much part of the only possible way to get out of apartheid, because if the settlements stay there, with the expansive, huge municipal areas, with the controlling to steal land from the Palestinians, this will deepen and deepen the apartheid, which will explode in unpredictable ways. Whereas we control it now and we say Jews can live in Palestine, but under Palestinian rules. Of course, the settlements, the built-up area, as you don't know, I was the chair of the B'Tselem Institution, human rights organization. We did a lot of measurement, and I can tell you that the built-up area of the settlements only covers about less than 2% of the West Bank. So geographically, if you reduce them to the actual size, is manageable. And of course, with the arrangement of what will be in the future. But it requires a lot of processing, a lot of agreement. It requires political leadership. And the same with the issue of the refugees. But we tackle these problems. We don't let them be swept under the rug. And yes, we think that there is a way forward with the settlements as well. How do you get from depressing current reality to the possibilities such as Confederation, which is a fascinating proposal? You're right. Of course, at the moment we are bogged down. So how do situations move forward? We saw the situation in South Africa. We saw the situation in Bosnia. We saw in Northern Ireland, 30, 40 years of what they call the Troubles, which was mutual terrorist. And what it requires is all kind of efforts coming forward, which is in academia and in NGOs like we do. We highlight the idea, we ferment new ideas. We hope that politicians actually try to promote this idea and take it forward. We're building up a movement. We are actually thinking about international, like we're doing now, build up international support. We also presented in the House of Lords in London, probably about 4 or 5 years ago. So there was one session. We're very, very welcome to address governments, address foreign ministers. And when you build up this kind of coalitions, and you see that this only way forward is this, because it looks utopian, but it's actually quite practical, because we said accept the situation as it is, but change the rules of the game. Make the Palestinians equal to the Israelis, and don't think about huge border change and uprooting. This makes it more practical. But change the management of the borders, change the management of the economy and the legal arenas. And this is why I think internationally it can be very much like Northern Ireland or Bosnia, which had very strong international support. It made the people on the ground that quite often were very hesitant about it. You remember Jerry Adams and Paisley. I remember the Bosnian leaders, but they accepted it with the right support from below, like we do, from the movement from the ground and international arena. So this is the way forward from the depressing situation at the moment, to have support, to have coalitions, to air these possibilities, and to see that there is a positive future, which is hugely important for the whole world, I think, because it's not just us, Jews and Palestinians. The land of Israel is very, very important for 2 billion Christians, 2 billion Muslims, roughly, this kind of numbers, and for the whole history of the world. So I don't have to convince you how important it is to have this as a symbolic from the most protracted, grave, cruel center of conflict, to have this as the maybe highlight of the 21st century movements towards peace. We need to energize ourselves with the possibility to move out of the deadlock. Isn't there a risk that a confederation would eventually lead to a loss of some sovereignty for Israel that would affect its nature as a homeland for the Jews? There could be a concern raised about it, but I don't see that. I see that Israel, first of all, in the Green Line border, is a sovereign state. And it allows to have what I think when we finally get a constitution, but as you know, it's a patchwork. Israel doesn't have a constitution, but it has a patchwork of basic law. Nonetheless, any constitution in the future, when there is a Palestine and there's border defined, will be that any Jew in the world under distress is welcome to Israel. I think this is the historical mission of Israel. So I don't see that at all under danger. The Israelis will always insist on that, and rightly so with the history of the Jews, that Israel will be a safe haven for Jews around the world. And I think that Palestine will address that for the Palestinians who have ongoing tragedy for the last 75 years or so, that Palestine will be a safe haven for Palestinians around the world. And let's not forget also the situation where Jews now have a state and the Palestinians still don't have a state. But I am not particularly worried, even though it could be a concern that open borders maybe will risk to some extent the nature of Israel, but I don't see that. There is also an advantage of the small nature of the land. Don't forget, this is not Britain. This is more like half Holland. So people that come to work or to shop from Hebron to Beersheba, where I am, which is half an hour drive, they will prefer to go back home, usually. And we have a lot of planning and housing laws that will eventually, I think, stabilize the situation like in Europe. In Europe, not tens of millions of people move around. Most people prefer the country, the region, the culture, but they have the freedom of movement, which is very, very much a conflict resolution winner. It's a joker. It allows people to share the space, and if it's rightly designed, without risking or impinging on other people's rights. They're actually signaling to me that we have 1 minute to go. Lots of overlap between the ideas and one democratic state group. What are the key differences? Good question, because we are in between the two-state solution that has failed for 73 years and the one-state solution that we think is apolitical. There's no platform under the legal political geography of the world to actually imagine Israel disappearing. I hope not. So I think we are close to the one democratic state idea in spirit. We want democracy, we want equality, we want peace. On the other hand, we are seeing the differences in the legal geography. Israel is a sovereign state and it has the right to stay that. And also most Israeli Jews will object to have one state. It might be forced on them through history, but if we at the moment now can intervene and make this a confederation, it will be for the benefits of Jews and for Palestinians. Let's forget that the right for state and self-determination, which is given to the Palestinians, they accepted to the UN as a state, as a non-member state, because Israel is preventing the establishment of a Palestinian state. This is the highest prize in international law. It's the highest prize in the power structure of the world. So I think this, rather than one state to have a confederation of two sovereign entities, it's a better solution for both Israelis and Palestinians. And they're telling me that our time is up. So I thank you very much. Please go to our Facebook, go to our internet site, contact us. We very much think that international support and mobilization is very important, especially through the Limud platform. You can reach a lot of Jews around the world, and your support is very, very, it's invaluable for us to get this project forward. And thank you very much for your participation.